Hi everyone! So my name is Madison Maddocks-Casada. I am a junior studying for my Bachelor's of Business Administration with a major in marketing. This project, John Locke, Enlightenment and Liberty in a Modern Context, was kind of the best way for me to do research into literature with a business degree. And I feel so blessed and lucky to be able to represent both the Rawls College of Business and the Honors College as the Remnant Trust Student Scholar. It has seriously been just a dream for me to be able to work here. And I hope you guys enjoy the project as much as I enjoyed working on it. So before I begin, I did just want to shortly discuss what I've done. Over the course of this semester, I devoted myself to roughly 10 hours per week of research through the Remnant Trust, mostly dedicated to reading each of these texts fully and also doing outside research into the context and kind of history of these texts, all of which was, again, absolutely mind-blowing, so interesting. I couldn't have asked for a better experience. And I wanted to also start by saying thank you to Alexander Root, expressing my gratitude to him as the project coordinator, and to Lee Peng, who was my advisor, both of which are incredibly fantastic mentors while I was on doing this project and ongoing. So I did want to start off really quick with one of my favorite quotes by John Locke. So this is that reading furnishes the mind only with the materials of knowledge. It is thinking that makes what we read ours. So I've always had a love for philosophy and how it interacts with the modern day. And so that's my focus, enlightenment and liberty, and in the modern day context, like kind of through this lens of John Locke. So this is one of my favorite quotes, I think, because it's very representative of my work. I have done the research, I've done the readings, and now I'm going to present to you my findings, so I do hope that you enjoy. It is definitely a bit of a dry subject, but it's something that brought me a lot of joy this semester, and I do hope that you can find some in it as well. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background information about Locke. So he's known as kind of the father of liberalism. He was really foundational to modern philosophical empiricism as well. He's kind of considered the origin of like really modern conceptions of identity and like who the self is considered, figuring really prominently in a lot of later philosophy and the works of people like Kant and Rousseau. And he was especially politically grounded in the notion of like a social contract and the importance of tolerance, which we will absolutely be getting to later in this presentation. Because I think some of his work was really groundbreaking and how he saw religion and government in particular, as well as youth and politics, is just fascinating takes. And I think they can be really representative of even modern day ideas and viewpoints. So we'll start off with this really fantastic book called Of the Conduct of Understanding, which was following some previous work he had done concerning education. And it's kind of his first attempt to really detail the beliefs he held concerning thought and human understanding. It was kind of convoluted, kind of messy. Locke admitted himself, I believe belatedly, that it was not one of his finest works. Compare it to like a freshman essay with probably a lot more thought and research behind it. It was published posthumously, so after he had passed away. And like I said before, it does complement some previous works concerning education. But I would consider this and the next book we're going to be talking about really fundamental readings when starting to understand how Locke thought and how he perceived understanding and thought itself, and as well as how he kind of expected other people to think. He had this belief of the tabula rasa, or the blank state of the mind, which we're all born with and we fill with experience of the world around us. Absolutely fascinating. And so Locke, in future works, he further discusses how he views thought. It's our observation employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that which supplies our understandings of all the materials of thinking. These are the two fountains of knowledge, from whence all the ideas we have or can naturally have do spring. So that's his whole concept, empiricism. And there's actually this little quote that's just talking about knowing his own understanding, and I thought it was so succinct and kind of matches exactly what I'm trying to say in this presentation, at least at the beginning, which is I'm trying to express how we can know our own understanding based off of the works of John Locke. So continuing on, in his essay concerning human understanding, which again, absolutely fantastic read, very fundamental in my opinion, in order to understand kind of how his mind works in reference to future ideas. So when we consider John Locke, we really should start by delving into this really iconic work in order to receive like a more nuanced view of his own patterns of thought. And I mean, have you ever really considered how people around you think and perceive the world, and how sometimes it's not so easy to observe what they really intend by their thoughts or actions? I think to understand and interpret how the everyday person views understanding and thought is to understand how they themselves see and interpret the world around them. And recently it seems like perhaps this empathy, which a lot of people, should express for other people or for, things in their surroundings, is lacking, and we should be able to have this more diverse perspective and have empathy for that diverse perspective. I would say that this novel is his second attempt at detailing how he kind of understands understanding and lays this basis for his concepts concerning ideas, thought, and the mind's way of perception. It was broken down into several volumes in order to completely detail his thoughts. He did discuss that he did want it to be less verbose because it's very wordy. However, he didn't really want his message to be misconstrued. Locke is notorious for that. He goes on and on, much like I do. And he just left it as it was because he figured it was better for it to be longer and exactly say what he wanted to say than it would be for it to be misconstrued. And so he just left it as is. He composed 4 books, and he filled them all with his understanding of thought. Again, absolutely foundational. If you read this book, I found it was a lot easier to comprehend kind of what he meant in further readings. So I think that these are particularly relevant to discuss before going into these further readings, and in part to consider modern day thought. So for example, in thinking versus reacting, do we allow ourselves to think, or do we react unnecessarily? Do we need to understand why we think and what we should think before we act on our thoughts? Do we behave in a certain way to put on a show or to fulfill this societal contract? And do we even violate certain principles that we hold others to uphold? I think that in reading this essay, you can have a more, in-depth understanding of why we do these things in our modern context. And I mean, even in, discussing this context, do we create discourse because it's profitable in that social context? In the same way that virtue is rewarded because it's profitable for society, which is, known as a social contract. And even considering in the modern age media involvement, is it profitable to have a certain amount of evil in the world and a certain number of arguments constantly abounding? It certainly keeps us distracted from self-growth and discovery. It keeps us distracted from the government or from corporate evils or from even, potentially evil things that we consider benign in our current society. So continuing on, I wanted to express a little bit more how we can apply these ideas that he brings up. I think as it stands today, in an era where opinions and information are more accessible than ever, and far more than they ever would have been in Locke's era, I think academia is really in a new world. It's just changed so much since the age of Locke, and however many concepts there are still these ones that are so foundational and can be built upon so easily in order to have this well-rounded assumption of the modern world and how thought kind of is intrinsic to humans in general and our society. You may not think that the modern world has a lot to do with the teachings of John Locke, but I think you would be mistaken in that assumption. Locke was absolutely one of the most influential people of his time, and in turn, we can see how his ideas kind of hold up in the modern day. we really live a life that we create, and a way to ensure that we live, a good one subjectively, is through the examination of people such as Locke, and through this ourselves. We see kind of these beliefs presented within his works that can be attributed to the context of his era, especially in the language that is used, because let me tell you, hardwiring your brain to read F's in place of S's is definitely a task, but that's not all that I mean. Locke also is sometimes considered progressive in nature, through his use of all men in his works. I think it's a good idea to keep in mind that he was writing for a very specific audience, white, adult, educated men with enough time on their hands to debate subjects such as philosophy. And I don't think there's any harm in identifying that, just to give the works greater context. I do think also that Locke believed knowledge was founded in empirical observation and experience, so that all ideas come from sensation or reflection, which we have briefly discussed. And I think that reflection is something that has really been lost to the ages, unfortunately, and people in the modern era are not as able or perhaps as willing to look at their actions. And at risk of sounding like I dislike technology, which I cannot stress is further from the truth, I think that we click, scroll, post, close the app, and go on with our day without necessarily understanding the potential impacts that we have on ourselves and on the world around us, especially, the potential impacts of what we do and who we speak to and how we speak to them. So, continuing on, we're going to be looking at actually one of my favorite works, The Reasonableness of Christianity. I thought this book was an enthralling read. I went into it, I think, a little naive almost. I didn't quite understand exactly how significant his findings would be for me personally until I had actually completed the book. And so I think that regardless of your spiritual or religious background, it can be a really significant and interesting read. I thought that kind of central to all of Locke's religious beliefs was his notion that every individual has within him the abilities necessary to comprehend his duty and achieve salvation through the scripture. And he also had this prioritization of tolerance, which I find extremely important, especially in the modern day. Especially for differences in worship. Even though Locke does believe Christianity to be consistent and rational, there's absolutely this belief that tolerance, particularly for different practices of religion, is good and should be encouraged. And I think this specific teaching can be exploited for comparison in the world today, where this political and religious spectrum has become so much less tolerant, at least visibly. And I do think that we can take some tolerance and some lessons from this, particularly as we go into the next book, which again, absolutely fantastic read, A Letter Concerning Toleration. I do think some context would be good. As far as Locke goes, he did have a Puritan upbringing, so very strict, very Christian. And as a young man, he did take a trip to Cleves and viewed this religious commune, wherein many different religious sects were living in harmony, something which drastically changed, I believe, his understanding of tolerance, particularly, as he had come from this very strict Christian upbringing. And I think it's a very strong beginning for some of the articles that he later publishes, both concerning toleration, education, religion, government. It's again, a really foundational piece of work. Although, if you ask me, I think most of his works are foundational to any kind of study you're going to do. And he also does discuss this concept of the law of faith and the law of works, wherein he kind of believes that those who are capable will intuit the existence of a merciful God, regardless of your background or other upbringing. So, in his view, as it's interpreted by me, he did believe that even those who perhaps weren't Christian or were following a denomination that perhaps was frowned upon at his time in his context, he believed with enough time and perhaps through reading scriptures would be able to kind of, locate this belief in God that aligned more with how he perceived Christianity, which is just absolutely fascinating. And so continuing, just looking at his sort of concepts of religious tolerance, Locke details further in this letter how civil government should not play a godlike figure, and that through civil government, we can find this responsibility for enforcing broken laws, which is agreed upon throughout the public. So that's the purpose of civil government, enforcing those laws, and it should be by the people and for the people. And there should be very little further intervention, particularly on matters of worship. Locke was very stringent in his beliefs about government and its place in society. One particular quote I did like from this passage was, "For no man can, if he would, conform his faith to the dictates of another." I think that really helps kind of follow his style of empirical thinking. It's all about sensation and reflection, and there's no time to be swayed by the reflections of others, only by the reflections of the self, which I think is really cool. It's kind of like that quote, to be a filter and not a sponge. I think that our reflection on our own experiences can bring us the best understanding of the world around us, and I do believe that Locke felt very similarly. So moving on into two treatises of government, Locke explores like a lot of concepts in this reading. However, I think that some of the most important ones are the ones concerning natural law, because if we establish these now, it will be really easy, I think, to continue the discussion on them as it continues. So he did have several different concepts conveyed in this text. So number one was a duty to preserve oneself from harm. Number two was a duty to preserve others when self-preservation does not conflict. Number three was the duty to not take away the life of another. And number four was a duty not to act in a way that tends to destroy. So generally, I mean, it's everything you would probably want in society. You don't want to get hurt. You want to prevent that from happening. You don't want others to be hurt. So if it doesn't conflict with you getting hurt, you want to help them. You don't want to hurt other people or kill them or act in a way that's hurtful to others. It seems pretty realistic, right? Pretty rational. And so we've kind of previously discussed Locke's disdain for government intervention on matters of worship, and so we can kind of discuss this as well. Essentially studying natural law as an intrinsic form of liberty and enlightened thought that we are owed just as people, like regardless of any kind of society that we're embroiled in, as people we are owed these concepts and laws. Our predisposition as people is kind of biased towards these things that we consider to be good character qualities. So as I kind of expressed earlier, those virtues as a part of the social contract. And so as we continue, and we kind of look at these notions of individual liberty, there's this concept of the state of nature, and it's known as these essential and intrinsic conditions of mankind. So just exactly what we were just talking about. And I think a way of perfect liberty in which one can live their life free from interference. This concept really predates civil authority. Again, government really has nothing to do with this, and neither does politics. However, it is not predating morality and morals in general. Locke was very clear about this. Natural law is not without morals. And at the time, in his context, some interpretations of natural law were essentially that man was beast, man was savage, and that in order to, come to some semblance of morality, you had to have God, or you had to have some kind of religious belief. And he did not believe in this, although he absolutely was a devout Christian. And so I think that there's also a couple other key concepts really, I think, entrenched in this reading. That being property is a key concept for Locke's argument for civil government, because he was not against civil government. He just did not like it when the government infringed upon these natural laws and natural rights that he believed every human was owed. And so government being the means by which an individual can protect the claim to their property and their land. And his definition of private property mixed their labor with the raw materials of the land. So for example, getting like a natural setting and tilling that into farmland, that would be considered private property in Locke's context. Unfortunately, this was a very anti-nativist viewpoint, taking into consideration his context. Essentially, Locke concluded that the land did not belong to the indigenous people because, in his view, they were not making use of it to its full potential. And doing so, unfortunately, I think it's very difficult to translate that to a modern context. I think we are a lot more aware of the impact that, things like colonization has on people, especially indigenous people. And so, as far as the law of nature goes, it presents limits to as much property as one can own, and that one should only take as much as one can use. Locke argues that when men leave this state of nature, it's in pursuit of the protection of their property. And that is why they partake in the social contract and why they establish civil governments. And unlike some of his fellow philosophers, Locke believed that the state of nature was willingly participated in. It wasn't something that they were forced into. It was people coming together to have a voluntary agreement to care for the children, and that's it. They were using morality, but not politics or government. And that these people created political society in coming together to give up these individual liberties in order to punish those who transgressed upon perceived societal rules, which were eventually put together, as well as the law of nature. So they essentially handed over their power to civil governments to ensure the power of majority rules. So I think it's really interesting now to kind of look at it in a modern context. Can we truly own property in this time when we are aware of the effects of colonization on indigenous societies? Can we own property through the exchange of goods, services, or money, even though we've not transformed the land? Is there perhaps a less literal interpretation wherein our private property may be an acceptable form of our use of liberty? And does the government even do a good job in protecting our individual right to private property? What about the people who have more property than they could ever use, which directly goes against some of Locke's teachings? What about those who get no property, or those who do no work and still get property, for example, through inheritance? I think that it can be very interesting to kind of think about these concepts and reflect on them in a personal context and kind of see where you come into it, where your privilege has come into it, and perhaps where you haven't had that privilege. It can be incredibly interesting and very, self-reflecting. And so in this modern day, we have a lot of rights, but we do not necessarily have fewer consequences. Things such as freedom of speech do prevent us from persecution for speaking on government and government bodies, but these concepts do not prevent us from the freedom of consequence, which is especially common these days in discussions among other people and of private places. So continuing on, we're going to discuss human nature, which I think is a really interesting point to kind of contextualize as far as Locke goes. He does say that by nature, men are free and equal in God rather than naturally subject to monarchy, which makes a lot of sense considering, he's in England at a time where there are certain monarchy bodies that perhaps not everyone was agreeing with, and that every human has the right to life, liberty, and property, that we have this foundation independent of the laws of society. Again, taking into consideration who he was writing for. Not all men, but men who were able to read his writings. So again, likely privileged white men of education. Men are unfortunately probably not as free and equal as we would like to radicalize his works to be. There were specific disadvantages worked into his society. However, we are on much more even footing as time goes on, very luckily, particularly on matters of justice and equality, although, of course, this is always something that we're working towards. And now, introducing his concept of government, again, I would say, he was not against governments, but he did not like it when governments infringed on the people's rights. And I think that this is a very commonly shared belief, especially in the modern day. As we continue Locke's discussion of government, power is a very interesting conversation. Overthrowing governments, which betray the people who put them in power, is something that Locke really likes to focus on. He shows very little tolerance or excuse for infringements on the rights of the people. Should tolerance for religion and the expectation of such be extended towards governments? As we've discussed previously, he obviously was really into tolerance. Locke saw tolerance for religion as a necessary part of society, but he also very clearly believed Christianity to be the rational religion, and that there should not be government or civil or political action on behalf of such religious organizations. He did recommend upheaval and rioting against governments when they infringed on those rights, and he was unafraid to say it, although it absolutely was not as radical as perhaps it appears to be when taking into consideration some of the discussions of his time, at a time of, revolution and tumult. And so this brings me to a very, very fun point to talk about, which is youth participation in politics. And so Locke really believed in the concept of self-authority and governance. This was a radical political philosophy for the time, particularly when looking at it compared to other philosophers. He expected the people to be able to rise up against stifling governments, which exerted too much power on people's rights to property or free will. As we've discussed, he did have one famous claim that a man should receive ownership over a product or private property once he has mixed his labor with it. Many people hold this philosophy very close to their hearts today, even if they do not word it so concisely. And so I think it would be really important to kind of consider the riots which we've experienced, particularly in the last several years. Sometimes they're lacking publicity, much of the time across America, but across the world, often things go on politically and involving civil governments that we are not always aware of, where these people are showing a rejection of what they consider to be an unjust government or a government that is not adequately addressing their concerns in society. Whether it is right or not in your perception, Locke believed in people's ability to rise up against unjust systems. Humanity today, I would say, is very reliant on protest, and that's not a bad thing. A lot of what social change we have is dictated by the ways in which we push back against societal norms. Consider unions, consider social movements. Oftentimes, the protests and riots which are most effective are the ones that bring about dramatic societal change, like the women's right to vote or the right of workers to health and safety policies. As far as radical political philosophy goes, I think we can take his words also to be something a lot more benign, or even to be more specific in regards to what he deems an unjust government. But what would be the fun in that? Do we ever kind of see this occur in our world? In regard to recent presidencies, political campaigns going back decades, are we seeing any kind of gain from the death, arrests, and pain of people on either side? It's definitely something to think about, especially, as we move into, the next decade. We really need to, I think, focus more on what we want for the future rather than what we want for the present. So, do we have the right to life, liberty, property? I would say yes, but it comes at a cost, because everything comes at a cost, especially in our society today. Do certain moral truths belong in places like religion, government, schooling? Morality is a fixture of our very beings as humans. I think it's hard to distinguish, and it's hard to make decisions on, and it's even more difficult to enforce. Not everyone is going to follow the same moral code, and this comes at a cost. However, meditation on the subject, I think, can bring great understanding not only about ourselves, but also about the people around us and the greater society that we live in. And I think through finding these kinds of meditations with ourselves, we can be more open and tolerant to different concepts of morality. So far as we are still adhering to these kinds of natural laws and rights, which Locke does discuss. So, can knowledge be preserved through books and portray this kind of amount of nuance as intended by the author in his context? I like to think that we can. I like to think that knowledge will always be held and treasured by those who prize information. And those who are in charge of dictating history do not always acknowledge things that are less than savory in relation to context for authors. So I think that we can attempt to preserve our understanding of knowledge as held in such books by contextualizing the history of the time and making guesses as to what was intended by the author based on their previous works, quotes, and general philosophies held. We're actually extremely lucky that we know so much about Locke, considering, his time. I think we are blessed in a way to have such detailed recordings of his works, and especially through the Remnant Trust, I was able to hold real copies of his books, which are very cool, very exciting stuff. So, can we truly adhere to the philosophies presented by Locke, or are we doomed to only recognize trends without allowance for change? I think that we can, to an extent and individually, recognize these trends Locke presents and kind of enforce this change into our own lives. However, it is unlikely that these changes would kind of unravel society, barring some massive catastrophe, knock on wood, we've already had COVID. I don't think we want anything else as far as that goes. But considering the systems which are in place, we are the only people who can enact change in ourselves. And I think reflecting on our experiences and understanding knowledge as an idea, we can come a little closer to unearthing who we are and what we're meant to be. And hopefully, in doing such, we are able to fulfill our natural rights and intrinsic liberties in this modern day life. Finally, are we willfully living in an environment where we give up freedom in return for other certainties? So, for example, let's discuss the social contract again. So, do we eagerly participate in things, for example, capitalism, but also disparage the concept? I also find this point really interesting because I think our willful acceptance of things such as capitalism in a society where there's little choice but to accept it, is that truly a choice? Is it willful if there is no other option? I think that there are many, many benefits to living in a capitalistic society, but to simply view these benefits without taking into account the costs would be doing everyone a disservice. I think other political and societal ideologies are not necessarily the answer, but perhaps it's time to view the fact that engaging in certain aspects of society does come at a cost, whether that be moral, monetary, familial. There's going to be an effect to our actions. So who is affected by our actions, our consumerism, our corporate-minded ideologies? Who is affected at the end of our time? And what knowledge and understanding will we choose to leave behind? It's something to acknowledge in a bid that we will be able to fix problems in our society rather than accept them and turn a blind eye. So finally, moving on to our very last bit. How does this affect the modern day? So through introspection, we can delve into the deeper parts of why we think about what we do the way we do. And I think if we can understand why people do what they do, and why we do the same or drastically different, who's to say that we can't enact change for the better? Perhaps this is what more of us need rather than simply choosing to surround ourselves with an echo chamber. I know I'm not the only one guilty of logging onto Twitter and being inundated by masses of information that all, completely agree with what I'm saying. I know you probably are very well aware of that too. I think it's very important to surround ourselves with diverse perspectives in order for us to become the best person we're meant to be. Many philosophers, in fact, were in the habit of listening to others, forming opinions, and coming at things with open minds, even when it's hard to do. And I think in a society such as today, when again that spectrum is becoming increasingly diverse, when parties are becoming increasingly bipartisan, it is so important to, even if you experience, dislike or even hatred of another person, their ideas still have absolute value. And if you do not at least accept the fact that they are entitled to those opinions and that you should listen to them, if only to create a diverse perspective, it's important. So, does philosophy have any true bearing on the world? Yes, I do think that we can entertain previous ideologies in order to mold our futures into our, future selves as students, as young adults, as people, as your future lawyers, doctors. We can see if we're, aware of these concepts. Our beliefs about the modern world, they change, and they eventually are expanded to a point where we can't return to our previous patterns of thought. Like if you've ever heard about the cave allegory, that is something I think is very, very necessary to believe in. And leaving this cave can be very scary, but it is so rewarding. You challenge your perspectives and you come to something that is new, and you can't go back, but you're growing up and you are, I think, finally embracing the kinds of concepts that you will leave behind when you finally leave Earth. And I do think that overall, admiring and interpreting the works of Locke, as seen through this modern context, brings a new hue to an otherwise multicolor spectrum of existence, perception, and ideas. And it's my hope that by sharing these ideas with you, I was able to inspire growth and challenge your beliefs for today and for your life as you see it. So, these are my citations. Again, a huge thank you to the Remnant Trust for allowing me to access these books, which are all available through the Trust thanks to Alexander Root. And again, thank you to Lean On Pang for being my advisor through the semester. And thank you to the library for their hospitality and showcasing my display. And I do hope I did not bore anyone with this extremely interesting project that I did enjoy making. With any research, there is a great deal of reading that goes into it. And so this project would have been absolutely lost without referring back to these new interpretations and understandings of old works. So thank you for being a part of this project and listening to me here today.